Hi everyone, I'm Suma and I'm here with Isaac Arthur. He's best known for his YouTube channel that explores concepts in science, futurism, and space exploration. Isaac, thank you so much for your time. I know you are an extremely busy person, so I deeply appreciate this opportunity.
Well, glad to be on. Thank you.
You have shared a lot of content on post-scarcity civilization. I had a few questions about that concept.
Sure, go ahead.
So one of the first things I wanted to ask was about poverty, like how poverty could still exist in a plentiful society like post-scarcity civilization. And one example I wanted to give to justify that point is like how Los Angeles city is like one of the wealthiest cities in the world, but there is still a problem of homelessness. So could such a problem could scale at a post-scarcity civilization level where
Sure. You just think about from the standpoint of food supplies these days. There was always a big concern in the 70s that we might run out of food to supply the population. Of course, we had the Green Revolution, and now we produce just ridiculous amounts of food per acre compared to prior generations. And yet you still have starvation in a lot of places, even though there's more than enough arable farmland often in those countries to support people. So you have a distribution issue that often comes into play, as well as a waste aspect too. With food production, we usually have about 30 to 40% get lost in between processing, shipping, spoilage at the table, etc. So inefficiency, instability of the local government, or any number of cultural or governmental issues can cause that sort of thing, even in a very wealthy society. On the flip side, though, if you all just increase your production to ridiculously high levels, if it's just very easy for you to mass produce everything people need, then that should tend to have a kind of a trickle down no matter what, so that the minimum standard of living should still go up a lot. But fundamentally, you can have all the production, all the wealth you want. If you're not, getting out there in a compassionate and fair and efficient fashion, you're still going to have issues.
so your point is that could still exist even in a civilization like that?
Yes, yeah, and it probably less than we'd have right now, for instance, but it could still be a factor. Yes.
And second problem I wanted to ask you was also about things like freedom of speech or corruption. For example, there are places on our planet which are very wealthy and very rich, some people don't have basic human rights or freedom of speech, or such places could also be very corrupted, and it's still not a desirable place to live. So could that also is possible in post-scarcity, where we have really advanced technology, but we may not have freedom, basic freedoms. In fact, we may be depending on
It's very, very much possible. You can be a tyrant in a wealthy culture or not. You think about the emperors of Rome, that was the most prosperous society that had existed at that time in the early 80s. And yet they certainly had no shortage of tyrants. Even list Nero or a dozen others. At the same time, prosperity does not necessarily bring freedom. It does not necessarily bring ethics. I like to use the other way around, that freedom and ethics tend to help with prosperity across the board. But, we often say the best way to define post-scarcity on the show is not so much to think about the sheer amount of raw materials and things like that, but more in the sense of what is the amount of anxiety people feel over these things. And you have to start including things like postal security, more just the food they're going to get tomorrow. And you also have to have considerations for things like, are they having access to information? Do they have free access to information? Are they, for instance, afraid that someone's going to come in, bust in the house, and put a boot on their neck the next day? In a case like that, you can be post-scarcity in terms of food supplies, but you're not really post-scarcity in the way we usually think of that term, in terms of prosperity and freedom for everybody. But as to a time being able to exist in a post-scarcity civilization, in some ways it's even easier, because very damaged governments tend to have a kind of a Darwinian, loss on them. They can't really operate very long on a global stage if there's so much corruption, so much injustice, that they just do not really function very well on the global stage. In a post-scarcity civilization, though, you can have types of government that are not very efficient at all, or just because they have so much production capability that they can't fail as a law.
So it could kind of make politics irrelevant? Is that what?
I can't imagine politics would ever be irrelevant to any civilization. I think, well, literally, the term politics, much like the term police, comes from an etymological root of the people, the public, and the city's the polis. So where you have civilization, you're going to have politics, I should think. But as to what flavors that would take on, what the most important things that are on a day-to-day basis, those would probably change a lot. Yes.
And do you see some kind of psychological transformation that could happen in society as we progress in post-scarcity? Maybe there is less sense of competition and things like that.
It would change in format, I'm sure, but you say competition in more prehistoric times, competition was generally focused around much more hunter-gatherer, tribal focuses, things like that. Who's the best hunter? Who's the best gatherer? That kind of thing. Nowadays, competition is usually focused on things like who's the best trader, who's the best scientist, who's the best scholar, who's the best businessman. So they always have to change. In a post-scarcity society, how you support yourself would generally be considered a lower concern because, again, the nature of post-scarcity is that you just don't have personal survival, personal security as a core thing people worry about from a day-to-day basis. So would that eliminate competition? No. Would that eliminate things like ambition or greed? Probably not. They would change focus, though. What people are focused on might be, who's the best person at playing a video game, for all we know, or who writes the best poetry, or who does the best artwork. There would be a shift, but I think it would probably be more diversified in nature of it than converge towards anything, and I would not expect it to drop off at all.
And what about changes like maybe there could be a lack of motivation or laziness? It could also create probably a narcissistic society because nobody needs anyone anymore.
It's a real concern that you might have a society that was basically very self-focused, very self-centered, very not social as well. And that's a problem. And actually, it's a very hard problem to overcome. We have an episode on it called Post-Scarcity and Purpose, which is just about trying to look at that. One addendum I usually put onto that, because it is a real problem a civilization like that could face, is that if you have the advanced technology to be, pumping out printable objects of everything people need on a daily basis, they have infinite food, infinite supplies, that kind of implies a level of science that presumably would hit areas like psychology, sociology, and the human condition, so that we should assume that they probably have other technologies available to them, other science available to them than just how to build robots and how to build better factories or agriculture. So they might be very good at figuring out these problems themselves. But most people really do tend to draw their day-to-day purpose from the culture they were raised in, and they don't really tend to deep think into the ideology or philosophy that much. So I suspect they would still find purpose. Again, they might shift that focus a lot. They might think that their purpose is one of those things where their driving motivation is just to be the best of this video game or have the best garden in the tri-state area or something like that. But I think people would tend to develop a purpose at some point. It would just vary a lot by the individual.
But is it possible that maybe that level of stagnation in itself is kind of like as concerning as a pandemic?
Oh yeah, it is one of our as we discussed in that episode, Post-Scarcity and Purpose. It's one of my preferred solutions for the Fermi paradox. The question of all the advanced civilizations is that maybe they just kind of collapse on themselves because they don't really have an interdependence driving them onward. Everybody see sound a little bit like some kind of debauched society, but we should also keep in mind that that kind of inward focus is not always what we think of as self-centered narcissism. It could be the same as like a monk or a scholar who goes into a retreat to spend a lot of time contemplating things. So it's not necessarily people sitting around the couch lazily, navel gazing all day long. They could be that they are very focused on, inward improvement or things like that. But it is a concern. It could be what causes civilizations to collapse. Too much of a good thing.
And some people have argued about how maybe post-scarcity is just a buzzword of like a bright future.
Mhm.
It probably is not a realistic future. What's your take on that? Is it just a
Again, we intentionally redefine the term on the channel to mean not so much an absence of scarcity, but a absence of anxiety about scarcity. Because you can't have an actual true post-scarcity of infinite size in a finite universe. There's not going to be an infinite supply of metal, an infinite supply of energy. But you can have a culture that has so much of these things that either because they give them out from the States or because they're so cheap, you can buy them with a pocket change, people just do not worry about where they're getting the next meal anymore. They worry about where they're getting the next breath or where they're getting the next sip of water. And we have plenty of examples of how people respond to that level of scarcity. You have a ship, though. You still have some scarce items. So we just say, and I like to use Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which is the old pyramid that's got up at the top the much more philosophical things, and down at the bottom there are things like food and shelter and not to be eaten by wild predators. Many of those ones we no longer have, and and depending on where you live, or even what era you've lived in, we've had samples of like the nobility or aristocracy of many countries that they never worried about what they were getting for the next meal, but they generally did have serious worries they dealt with. So it moves up that hierarchy, and we say it's not there's an absence of these things at all. Is there just very little personal anxiety about fulfilling that need? Um, and in that kind of context, it's not a buzzword anymore because it's actually something that kind of applied to civilization. As to whether or not we could ever be a post-scarcity civilization in that kind of context, about the only thing that's really holding us back right now is, I would say, probably just the lack of renewable energy. We need a better energy system, something that we not only can churn out a little bit cheaper than we have now, but in a much higher quantity indefinitely. Something like a big improvement to solar power, an advancement in nuclear fusion, people getting more comfortable with nuclear fission even. If it brings the prices down to the point that it's just half of what it is now and sustainable, at that point in time, so many things are affected as a feedback on that cheaper power, your knock-on effects that we'd probably flip into post-scarcity right now. And you could argue that if you ignore that lack of sustainability, most of the first world countries are already at post-scarcity level. Although obviously that's a pretty debatable point, but you see it starting to emerge. The standard of living has risen for this planet, even the poorest areas, the standard of living is still higher than it was a century ago. And for most of the world, they're enjoying a level of personal prosperity that a century ago, people probably would have been calling post-scarcity if they'd seen it. So I don't ever expect civilization to actually say it's post-scarcity though, because once you've eliminated other problems, you're saying, well, we have it easy. It's just not something people say. Yeah. So they could have post-scarcity made Star Treks, look like it was on the cheap and poor side and still be like, we have so many problems, but that's human nature.
and that's kind of like suggests, like, some people have also argued about how we can never be a post-scarcity civilization, because even if our biological needs are met with food and shelter, now we'll have a new set of needs. For example, that could be like space exploration, or wanting to own a spaceship. So it's like upgrading your needs, and then we have new kind of scarcity. So what do you think about that? Like, that's one of the arguments people use about how forced scarcity is not possible.
Something a civilization that's got good enough automation that they can do is to outright build a planet, and say, wow, that's a fun endeavor, but at the same time say, well, okay, they can build a planet. Can they build a planet for every single person? And you actually could if you were doing this galaxy wide right now. There's more stars in this galaxy alone than there are people, but there is a limit. You couldn't say everybody gets to have their own planet. You might have a setup where some people could and some people couldn't. I don't know, but you couldn't have everybody having anything they wanted. Period. And when we phrase post-scarcity that way, yes, that is the impossible goal. That's not going to happen. You could theoretically do something like that, like a virtual reality setup, but even that has some limitations. You want a house without a gold, it's easy in virtual reality. If you want to live an entire planet of sentient creatures that are being simulated to the point they seem like people, no, that comes down to processing power and becomes a finite quantity again. So even in virtual reality, there are limits. Scarcity is shared. But again, that's why we put so much of the emphasis on, if you want to use the term post-scarcity, actually discuss these topics in a useful fashion, you have to redefine it in some fashion that isn't just infinite resources. And that's why we use the, you know, hierarchy of needs and the lowering of anxiety or easier access. Although I'll put a qualifier on that. We say lower anxiety, we mean lower anxiety because of ease of access as opposed to just not caring anymore. One of our show editors, Matthew Campbell, he coined the term post-discontent, post-discontent society, which is a post-scarcity society. It is not a post-scarcity society, but rather one in which people feel like they got all their needs met because they just don't worry about it. Like this would be one way they will, for instance, brainwash and not caring about it because they live in miserable huts, but they feel happy about everything. So we call that a post-discontent society. And the loose idea we go for post-scarcity is these folks have a legitimate reason to believe that they have all their basic needs and more sophisticated needs easily met, that they just don't really worry about any of these survival things, including some of the more complicated things like social structure. But when you look at something like the hierarchy of needs, you'll see on there things like, you know, getting married, having kids, right, or social status and respect. If you try to do that from a governmental standpoint, where you just give everybody their basic needs, you can't really fulfill things like that without having something like a government department of dating. I don't think most of us would like to do it that way. Or you know, so some of these really are not ones you're going to be able to meet through a post-scarcity situation, period. And others, you know, depending on how you want to look at it, I'm just using an example. We've come a long way in helping people find folks online, for instance. So again, post-scarcity was defined as infinite access to whatever you want. Yes, that is a complete dream term. You're never going to be able to fulfill that, at least under known science. But you know, if we want to use a term to discuss what we usually mean by that, which is just advanced societies where it's very prosperous and very educated if they choose to be, and very much, you know, not worry about their day-to-day life struggle, then yeah, that definition of post-scarcity is something I think we will easily meet inside the next century or two, except that the civilizations doing them probably will still say, oh no, we're not. We still have all these corners in front of them. But that doesn't mean they haven't actually reached that state from our perspective at least.
And how do you see the concept of universal basic income fitting in with post-scarcity? Is the basic income something that will help us move into post-scarcity, or would post-scarcity make it irrelevant to have a basic
I'm
income?
sorry, could you say that one again? The signal got clicked out on us.
How do you see the concept of universal basic income fit in with post-scarcity? Would the basic income move us into post-scarcity, or would post-scarcity make basic income irrelevant?
There is well, there's a bit of a concept mismatch sometimes when folks talk about this. In a post-scarcity society, they say, well, maybe you could give everybody basic needs, or we could say, well, maybe things are just so cheap that that we could just easily buy it. I mean, we could work an hour a week and keep them self-supported. This kind of misses what we really mean by post-scarcity in terms of production. You don't need a UBI to cover giving people drinking water. You don't need a UBI to give people the air to breathe. They could buy it too, maybe for 1 cent a month, or their water bill for $10. The degree of production involved in something being post-scarcity, to the point that people are not anxious about it, is where it's just is kind of a irrelevant issue at that point in time. You provide those basic needs. It would be, well, here's your entire food supply for the equivalent of $1 of what we think of as modern money. Here's everything you need for that. Well, are you working for it? Is it being given to you? It's kind of secondary. It's just the sheer amount of it available at that point in time means you don't really do it through traditional capitalist or socialist standpoints on, because it's too far down the ladder to actually care. It is like providing something like trying to think of some really basic service that everybody just takes for granted everywhere. The post office, but maybe not the best example. But
You you froze in between, Isaac. If you could repeat.
you know, people want to know. Oh, sure thing. It's something that's just such a low production that you don't have to worry about it. We don't worry about whether or not we can pay for email. The richest man, the poorest man, that's not a consideration. You don't need a UBI to give people email. You don't need a capitalist system to give them email in terms of access. It's just so far down the threshold free. It's a side note, right? Seems we don't have a long distance anymore on phones. When I was a kid, you had to pay a lot of money for a long distance phone call, and you didn't do them very long, and you had to collect phone calls. Those are all gone, and not because of some massive shift in how we choose to view the economy, but simply because it's gotten so cheap that nobody cares. It's just below the threshold. Why would you charge people per minute for on distance phone call? Why would you charge them per email? You might do it in bulk or to avoid abuse, but for the day-to-day consumer, it's just not an issue. And that's the degree of scarcity that we have to think about when we're just talking about post-scarcity for basic needs, is that perspective, that it is like air, like water, like your email, like long-distance phone calling, it's gone. And that's as to whether or not something like that could be brought about by UBI or not have a result from UBI is kind of going from the wrong perspective to begin with, because it's just we didn't need UBI for telephone calling, for instance, or for air, or for water, or for email. It's just there. Post scarcity is all about having such a high level of production that it's just not an issue.
So basically, maybe even cash would be maybe then not necessary.
There was also the idea in Star Trek that you wouldn't have any money, and that's possible. But usually, whenever anyone envisions a society without money, they just rename it. Money is a generic way of exchanging power and influence with people who you do not have a deep social connection with. That's why you don't really use it inside families or small tribes. Everything there is being done on a favor basis and things like that. When you travel next door to another, tribe where people don't know you, don't know if you're trustworthy, things like that, that's when you suddenly need some kind of token to use. You can still do barter, but it gets a little bit complex. If you got fish and nobody that there wants the fish, but you're trying to get bread from or things like that. So you invent some kind of liquid form of currency you can bring along with you. But whether or not you need that in the future, we don't pay for air. We don't really pay for water per gallon or things like that. We don't pay for emails individually, really. We still have money, so maybe we're not paying for food anymore. We still have money. You still go pay at a restaurant because that restaurant is doing something particularly currency. If somebody has something and somebody else would like it, there has to be a medium for exchange. In a civilization where you have vast amounts of production, you still have some kind of medium of exchange because maybe someone really, really wants a planet. That's their big thing. They've worked their entire life to have a planet built, and that's not something normally allows. They have to exchange favors, whatever it is, to get that built or to pay for it. So you pretty much always end up with some kind of currency. It's just, a rose by any other name, or if we choose to view it that way. You're going to have something that is either money or as close to it as makes no difference in any civilization, no matter how prosperous, just because there's only 1 or 2 copies of Action Comics number 27 available to them. If someone really wants that original copy, comes unstuck from basic needs.
And this is my last question because I know you have to be somewhere. I'm really interested in your take on what's the nature of reality. Do you think it's a physical matter-based reality, or is it a virtual reality?
Whenever we're talking about simulated reality, as people say, is this universe real or is this simulation? Or is this universe real or is it just a dream? I think that's always overlooking the more important question of, does it actually matter? A lot of our older stories and mythologies or religions have the basic idea that we are an image of God, a dream of God, or something like that, that we could wake up any moment. Nobody there was saying that they weren't living in the reality, though. It's the idea is that anybody who's up in that level, be a God or a simulating computer, enough. We have no way of improving internally whether or not we live in a simulation or not. You can't know. Whoever's doing it, they'd have to really mess up or just tell you that you're in one if you'd ever find out. If their goal was to make it seem like you were in a virtual reality, but when it was real, did pull it off. So your only way of actually ever knowing is if they let you know. And so it kind of becomes a question of, does it actually matter? Because this is the only reality I've ever known. And my very concept for reality is based out of my observations of this reality. And so this is reality. That other thing then, from a more classical perspective, we say it's real too, but it'd be the layer above, as we were. Or computers all the way up, totals all the way down, as they like to say. So again, for whether or not we're in a simulation, from a principle of indifference perspective, you could view it as, 33%, because it's even odds, as it were, that you can do these simulations but don't do them, can do them but you do them all the time, or the civilizations just don't get the ability to do this. If that's the case, then only in one of those do they do it a lot, in 1 in 3, and there's always a small chance that you are actually in the real reality, even though many of them are fake. So 33%, that's your odds of being in a simulated reality. Now, of course, that's from the principle of difference, so it really is a useless number. We aren't, but that's about the odds.
Thank you so much, Isaac. I think your channel is really unique, and it's one of my favorite channel. I spend so much time listening to it almost every day. What you have created, it's brilliant. I really appreciate your content, and I wish you all the best.
Thank you very much. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Same here.